key to our work, and as challenging as the situation is right now for our oceans on a wide range of fronts, there is a lot that we can do, and there is a lot of really exciting stuff happening. So I'm going to try to hit that same balance in this presentation. Try to share my screen here. Okay. Now, are you able to see just the slides, or are you seeing the notes and all that?
Both. We can see the next slide, but we can't see the notes.
You can see the next slide. Okay.
Like we can see the slide, and yeah.
There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks again for having me. I'm going to chat a little bit today about one of the key tools that we have for ocean conservation, and one that's Canada is focusing on pretty heavily right now, and that's marine protected areas. As we'll see, management of our oceans and protected areas in our oceans tend to lag behind what we've done on land. So we've had this well-established national parks system for many decades. We're kind of behind the 8 ball right now in terms of the amount of protection that our ocean ecosystems need relative to the protections that are in place. And in particular, I'm going to link to a concept called blue carbon, and this just refers to marine species that capture and store atmospheric carbon dioxide for long periods of time, and so represent an important part of climate change mitigation. And that'll come kind of towards the end. First, I'll introduce what protected areas are, what they do, progress here in Atlantic Canada, and then I'll shift towards that component of it. To start with, there's this nice quote from Sylvia Earles, a famous marine explorer, marine scientist. And she says, "With every drop of water you drink, every breath you take, you're connected to the sea." And it's really not exaggerating it to say that all life on Earth depends on the ocean. We depend, more than half of the oxygen that we breathe comes from marine plants. Food for hundreds of millions of people come from seafood. And it also regulates our climate. And so changes to the health of the oceans have very wide-reaching implications for human populations, both on the coast as well as inland. And unfortunately, over the past 150 years, there have been we've treated the ocean in an extractive way, to the point where the research that's happening has been dominated by headlines like this, talking about how biodiversity in the oceans has declined. We're seeing something called trophic downgrading of planet Earth, which means we've taken out all of the large-bodied predators, and we're kind of working our way down as they become scarcer and scarcer. And that has a profound effect on the health of our ecosystems. The quote here on the top one says, "A synergy of human threats, including overfishing, global warming, biological introductions, and pollution, has caused a rapid decline in marine biodiversity around the world." And what that's saying is that there's very rarely one factor that causes these kinds of declines. It's often a subtle interaction between multiple stressors. So if you have rising temperatures that are harming coral reefs, for example, around the world, that makes those coral reefs more susceptible to physical damage. It takes them longer to recover from other types of disturbances because they're less resilient. So it's often that combination of factors that causes problems. So recognizing this, Canada has signed on is a signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And as part of that convention has agreed to protected various targets. So for 2020, they set a commitment of 17% to protection of land and 10% protection of marine and coastal. And this chart shows the progress that has been made over time in land-based and ocean protection. So the land is the green line. You can see that's been quite ahead of our oceans protection for a long time. And oceans protection in Canada really didn't start to take off until about 2015. We were sitting at about 1% of our coastal and marine waters protected until those commitments were made, and the percentage started to jump up. There are two blue lines here because there are different categories of marine protection. Some have stronger standards. They exclude more activities than others. And I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but the general point on this slide is just that since 2015, a lot of good things have happened. And we've actually exceeded that 2020 target. We're sitting now at about 14% of our ocean area is protected, despite the target being only 10%. And on top of that, at the last election, our Prime Minister committed Canada to protecting 25% of our coastal and marine waters by 2025 and working toward 30% by 2030. And Canada's actually shown quite a bit of leadership internationally on this. We're part of what's called the Global Ocean Alliance, which is pushing countries around the world for that 30% by 2030 target, and there are 30 countries together that are working on that. All the 30 countries pushing for 30% protection by 2030. So what does protection really mean? When we think about national parks, it's the same idea, just in a marine context and regulating slightly different activities. And there are a wide range of different protection tools that we can use, and strong MPAs, or marine protected areas, are the cornerstone. There are all kinds of other discussions around, how we manage our fisheries, how we regulate various other industries. The idea behind MPAs is that we have this sort of insurance policy where we have these areas where we limit most activities to give the ecosystems and the life there the best chance to recover and thrive in the absence of those. Now, in addition to that protection, we need to keep working on improving the sustainability of all of our ocean uses. But if we have that sort of bedrock set of protected areas to lean on, that's somewhat of an insurance policy. So marine protected areas are essentially boxes that we draw in the ocean, and we make different decisions about what kinds of activities can happen in those boxes. So they are very good at protecting some species from localized human impacts. So for example, if we exclude bottom trawl fishing from a protected area, that protects the whole sea bottom. Bottom trawl fishing is basically a big net that has a long metal bar on wheels, and that's dragged across the bottom, and everything that's churned up flows into the net. And it's a very indiscriminate or non-selective type of fishing. And so by excluding that from an area, we can preserve corals, sponges, fish that live on the bottom, all kinds of invertebrates. So that's one of the clearest applications of marine protected area. And this means we can also protect important breeding, feeding, or migratory habitats, because a lot of marine animals, fish, whales, seabirds, sharks, they all move big distances, but we can keep their key habitats intact, especially ones that are associated with particularly important stages of their life cycle, like breeding grounds, for example. And protected areas can also help mitigate climate change and overfishing. And climate change in particular, there are coastal species, as I described, that like the eelgrass, actually, that you see in the background of this image, they're very good at taking carbon dioxide up out of seawater and storing it in sediments beneath the plants. And so they are effective at mitigating climate change. So that's another potential benefit, particularly of coastal sites. There are also, there's lots of things that protected areas can't do. For example, ocean acidification is a real problem. As more carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere from greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of that carbon dioxide gets taken up in the oceans, and that increases acidity of the ocean water. And drawing a box to keep there's nothing that a protected area can do for that particular threat. Similarly, plastics is in the news a lot. Plastics getting into the ocean through our waterways, and marine protected areas aren't particularly effective for those things. So I think it's just important to recognize that this is the cornerstone of effective ocean conservation, but it does have limits. It's not a cure-all. So there's a really neat online tool if you're interested in seeing the progress that we're making globally or regionally on ocean protection, and it's called mpatlas.org. Down in the lower right is the web address. And it's an interactive map. You can zoom in and zoom out on different areas, and you can actually click on each box and see when it was established, what it was meant to protect, what kinds of regulations are in place, as we work towards this global 30% by 2030 ambitious target. And if we zoom in on Atlantic Canada, this is a synopsis of where we are here. And I'm not sure, can you see my cursor? You can?
Yes,
okay,
we can.
great.
Yes.
I can.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm going to take you on a little bit of a photo tour through Atlantic Canada's marine ecosystems and highlight a few of the different protected areas that we have in place, particularly with a focus on Nova Scotia, because that's what I know best and that's where I work. It all started in Atlantic Canada with the Gully MPA, which you may have heard of. It's located about 250 kilometers off the coast of Halifax. It's this green and blue box here. And what it is, it was a glacially carved canyon that flows out over the continental shelf into the deep water here. I think at its deepest, it's about 4 or 5 kilometers. And this site is home to an endangered population of bottlenose whales, which I think I have a photo of here. So these guys are a deep diving species that forage for fish way down in the deep dark. They're a toothed whale, which means they find their food through echolocation. So they create sound from their head, and the sound reflects back at them, tells them where their food is. And this population is fairly resident in this area. And so at least they occur in high densities there. And so the MPA was put in place partially to protect them. And it was put in place to protect cold water coral reefs. So this is something that I had never knew growing up, but Canada has very vibrant coral reefs. We typically think about those being tropical, but there are lots of them here off the Atlantic coast. And this is just a shot of some of them. And they create habitat for all kinds of things, shellfish, fish, other invertebrates. They really are kind of like the forest out there of the seafloor. They're a habitat creator that creates all kinds of opportunities for other species. So that protected area was put in place for those 2 reasons in particular. Let's go back to the map here. I've highlighted a couple more. So this one here is called the Laurentian Channel MPA. And this was established in 2019 because this is where the St. Lawrence River flows out into the Atlantic Ocean. And so this is an important migratory route for all kinds of different whale species. Blue whales, for example. I see you're having Dave Ireland on next month or next week, maybe, to chat about blue whales and climate change. So that's great. Humpback whales, fin whales, minke whales, all the kind of the big great whales that are of interest to people and to whale watching industry. They come through here and migrate into the St. Lawrence to feed, and then back out when they migrate south during the wintertime. So this protected area has kept oil and gas drilling and exploration out, bottom trawling out, basically all fishing. Most fishing is kept out of this protected area in order to keep that habitat relatively stress-free for those migrations. St. Anne's Bank MPA is off the coast of Cape Breton. And this one, I can actually show you some photos. Oops.
Okay, so the St. Anne's Bank one was in particular put in place to protect sea bottom habitats. And again, we had a photographer named Nick Hawkins go out and do a bunch of photography for us just to show the diversity of life that's out there. And we often don't think of Canada as having this colorful marine life, but this is the bottom. And there's all kinds of stuff in here. These are anemones. They are closely related to jellyfish. They have little stinging cells on these arms that capture particles that are drifting by in the water. That's how they feed. There are sponges here. Oh, let's see a chat. Yeah, thank you for sharing that link. Sponges and sea squirts. These are all filter feeding organisms that filter water through their bodies and capture floating bits of food. And then urchins, like these guys down here, which scrape algae off the rock on the sea bottom. So amazing, colorful diversity in some of these sites. This is another one. This looks sort of like an alien landscape to me, but these are stocked sea squirts. So these are, again, filter feeders. They take water in through these openings, flush the water out through the other, and then they extract food as the water is passing through. And they create all kinds of habitat opportunities for other species. This is an endangered wolffish, very long-lived, slow-growing species, which means that if they're overfished, it takes them a long time to recover. And they live in rocky reefs and sea bottom habitats, much like the ones in the St. Anne's Bank region off the coast of Cape Breton. And then there are many other species in the offshore of Nova Scotia, like this pilot whale. This is similar to the northern bottlenose whale. They're a toothed whale that feeds in deep water on fish and echolocates in order to hunt. You might see these guys in close to shore in the Maritimes as well. This is a minke whale. So a minke whale is one of the baleen whales, which means instead of teeth, they have a comb-like structure that's made out of keratin, which is the same as your fingernails. And they have this sort of comb-like structure that hangs down from the top of their mouth. And when they feed, they'll take in a big gulp of seawater and small fish. They'll push the water out through that baleen and keep the fish in and swallow it. So that's their foraging tactic. They're one of the most common whale species on the Atlantic coast, and they migrate into the St. Lawrence, often through Laurentian Channel in the summertime to feed. And then this beautiful creature is the ocean sunfish. Basically a big open ocean wanderer. Feeds on jellyfish and invertebrates and slow moving fish. And has this very bizarre body shape. You might see them even in close to the coast here. But to me, just one of the most baffling creatures as to how these things survive. But yeah, another interesting example of the biodiversity we have here off our coast. And then when we get closer to shore, the life becomes more familiar. Obviously, everybody's favorite bug, the American lobster, which makes use of all the shallow nearshore habitats, eelgrass beds, rockweed habitats, very common. And then these shallow nearshore habitats, as I'll talk about in a little bit, are particularly important as nursery habitats for many fish species, including some of our key commercial species like lobster, like cod, like herring. Some of the most important and financially lucrative ones spend their early years inshore in these very shallow nearshore habitats. So it's really important that we have the right levels of protection to keep their habitats intact. And just another shot again, the along shore, for those of you who live close to the Atlantic coast, you'll be very familiar with the rockweeds and the intertidal seaweeds. And they are also what we call habitat creators. They create a lot of habitat opportunities for small fish and juvenile fish. So again, a nursery function of these spaces. So again, very important that we keep those in good health. So in addition to exceeding the 2020 target of 10% protection, we also had some positive progress on protection standards for protected areas in 2019. So our Minister of Fisheries and Oceans then, Jonathan Wilkinson, announced
new standards that would apply to all new marine protected areas across the board, which keeps out bottom trawl fishing, any dumping, mining, and oil and gas exploration. And believe it or not, before this point, it was sort of done on a case-by-case basis. So there was oil and gas exploration and drilling allowed in some of our marine protected areas. And bottom trawling still exists in some of our marine protected areas on the West Coast in particular. So any new sites moving forward as we work toward this 2030 target will not have any of these activities, which is great. But there's a catch, as there always is. And that is that we still allow oil and gas in marine refuges in Atlantic Canada. So at the beginning, I showed that curve with the two blue curves showing our marine protection progress. There's a category of protected area called marine refuges, which is established by Fisheries and Oceans Canada and only regulates fishing activity. So it doesn't have the ability to regulate oil and gas or mining or any of these other industries. So unfortunately, we have this situation in Atlantic Canada where some of our fishing fleets have agreed to these protected areas at cost to them, but the oil and gas industry is still allowed in. So on the MPA Atlas map, these gray areas here that are various strange shapes, these are the marine refuges. So they have been established to keep bottom trawling out. Any kind of fishing that would damage the sea bottom can't occur in these sites. But because of this jurisdictional loophole, an industry that drills straight through the sea bottom and risks various spills and discharges is still allowed in there. So that's a big concern for us. And this is a case in point. Sort of the ground zero for this debate right now is off the coast of Newfoundland in a place called Northeast Newfoundland Slope. So this is actually Atlantic Canada's largest protected marine area. High densities of corals and sponges that create habitat for all sorts of fish and invertebrates. And unfortunately, these green blocks are exploration licenses or areas that have been bid on for oil and gas exploration. So about 25% of this so-called protected area is still open to oil and gas exploration and exploitation. This is a policy issue that's going to be ongoing. It's a bit of a heavy lift. Our federal government doesn't seem, because oil and gas is so important for the economy of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is understandable. The government there is very keen on pushing forward and expanding in this area. So we have a real conflict there over what the purpose of this space is, and will it actually be able to achieve a conservation objective if it's being explored. Another challenge that we have is that at most of the sites that I've shown and that you've seen on that map are offshore areas, and we really need to focus on some of the coastal sites as well. But obviously things become more complicated as we move closer to shore because there are more types of uses and closer connections to coastal communities and economies than there are in the offshore. But one of the reasons why we need to work through this problem is because there is an important link to climate change and marine protection. And so for the last 10 minutes or so, I'm going to dig into that a little bit and some of the species that we want to protect. So my research background was, I studied seagrass meadows in Australia for a number of years, particularly studied the animal populations that live within them. But what I learned over there was a lot about the huge ecosystem importance of seagrass meadows. So seagrasses are closely related to grasses on land. They're a flowering plant. They grow in shallow coastal waters up to maybe 10 meters typically, sometimes a little bit deeper. And they're important for a whole bunch of different reasons. So the first is that they are a nursery habitat, much like rockweed and those shallow coastal sites. They provide habitat for juvenile cod, for juvenile lobster, for crab, for herring, a lot of the really key species out here for our economies.
They also are very good at sequestering carbon dioxide. And the way they do this is they take, so carbon dioxide that comes into the atmosphere through organic greenhouse gas emissions, gets mixed into the seawater. Seagrasses take that carbon dioxide up and they use that to create energy, and they produce oxygen. And over time, what these plants do is they capture and bury all kinds of organic material. So when fish die, when seagrass dies, when seaweed dies, it gets trapped at the base of seagrasses and just they create this sediment layer that holds it in place for long periods of time. So that's what carbon sequestration refers to, and this is what blue carbon refers to. There are other species as well, like mangrove forests in the tropics and salt marshes all around Atlantic Canada also do this. They create this sediment layer where they bury carbon. So we call these blue carbon habitats. They are common all around the world. They fringe shorelines up to 40 meters in depth. Here in Atlantic Canada, because the water is not particularly clear, seagrasses need lots of light, so they tend to be a shallow water species and only go up to about 10 meters or 30 feet. This is the only graph I'm going to show, but there's a lot of interest in the research world right now at understanding how efficiently seagrasses and salt marshes store carbon compared to terrestrial forests. We've known for a long time that our forests on land take up carbon dioxide and trap it in the roots and in the actual biomass of the forest. Here, these bars represent the rate at which these habitats bury carbon in the sediments beneath them. And you can see that the marine habitats are very efficient compared to most of our forests on land. Now this is on a per area basis, and so there's far less salt marsh and seagrass meadow compared to our boreal forests, for example. But this just goes to show that it is really important that we take good care of these coastal ecosystems because of the role that they can play in fighting climate change. And they play another role on the adaptation side of the coin as well, because seagrasses create these shallow sandbanks that buffer our coastlines from storm surge, very much like salt marshes, the wetlands along our coast that protect our coastline from erosion by absorbing the energy from storms when they come in. So these habitats are both important for mitigating climate change as well as helping us adapt to climate change. This is my favorite seagrass fact. There's a species of seagrass in the Mediterranean Sea. And this particular meadow that's pictured here can be up to about 6,000 years old. It's one of the oldest known living organisms on the planet. And the reason is that they grow in a clonal way. So each shoot, each leaf that you see coming up comes from a node. And from that node, what's called a rhizome grows horizontally under the seabed, and then it sends up another shoot, and it grows out and sends up another shoot. And those are all exact clones of one another. So by repeating this over and over again, these plants live for many thousands of years.
Can I ask a question? Just a quick.
Sure, yeah, of course.
You said we could. So if this is disturbed, does it release all the carbon?
Yes. Yeah. So I was actually in a part of Western Australia at the time that an unprecedented marine heat wave hit in 2011. And what happened there was over the span of about 6 months, all the above ground stuff, all the leaves and stuff that you see in a photo like this died off. And when that happened, the roots started to dry out and decay. And then after that happened, those roots are what stabilize all the sediment. And so once that happened, the tide currents just whisked the entire sandbanks away. And so all of that carbon that was in the plant material and all the carbon that was in the sediments is released back into the ocean and back into the atmosphere. And that's an interesting case, because in that particular site, it's sort of at the warmest range limit for that particular seagrass species. So that's an area that's going to undergo a lot of change in the coming years, and that kind of thing is going to keep happening. Where we are here in Nova Scotia, eelgrass is the main species. It looks a lot like the one in this picture. And it's still predicted to do quite well with climate change for the next several decades, because it ranges all the way down to, I think, the Carolinas or something like that. So it's not at that, right at the edge of its heat tolerance. Excuse me. And in the last fun fact about this one is that the sediment layer that this seagrass bed creates can be 10 meters or 30 feet deep. So it's hugely impressive, the amount of carbon sequestration that these habitats can do. So unfortunately, in terms of how our blue carbon habitats are doing overall, it's not a rosy picture right now. So we've lost an estimated 25 to 50% of salt marshes, seagrasses, and mangroves in the past 50 years. In Atlantic Canada, for example, a lot of the natural salt marsh was replaced by farmland through land reclamation and the diking system, particularly along the Bay of Fundy. And moving forward, there are concerns about sea level rise and how quickly that will happen, and how that will influence salt marsh's ability to provide all the functions that it naturally would. And seagrass meadows, it's also not rosy. There are a whole range of different reasons, but poor water quality because of fertilizer runoff from agriculture, for example. There are some invasive species that are highly damaging to seagrasses. So the rate of decline right now is estimated to be about 7% per year. That might be a bit high, but it is a real problem. So what can we do? So there's this category of blue carbon climate solutions, and there's sort of a hierarchy. There's a pyramid of priorities. And the first priority always has to be to protect intact habitats, because intact habitats that are older have much more carbon sequestration potential than habitats that are younger and are just starting to form those sediment layers and are starting to fulfill that function. Intact habitats also tend to be more complex. They have more species, and more species means more biodiversity, more resilience, generally healthier in most cases. So for example, if we're thinking about our federal government is saying we're going to plant 2 billion trees, that's great. But, if we plant fast growing single species, that's not going to give us nearly the same amount of carbon sequestration as intact old growth forest that has a big mix of species and has that deep sediment layer in place. So this is where protected areas meet climate change. It means we need to figure out where the highest value blue carbon areas are and make sure that we're taking care of whatever the local stressors are to keep those in place. Then the second priority is managing all of our ocean areas more sustainably. So we can't protect everything. If we're going to protect 20 or 30% of our oceans, that leaves 70 or 80%, where we just need to manage our activities more carefully. So that could be something as simple as not having boats anchor in seagrass beds, because a boat anchor will rip it straight up. Or creating hard shoreline structures like breakwaters that increase sediment in the water, and that reduces light available to the seagrass and decreases the health of the seagrass meadow. So those are kinds of things that we can do without necessarily protected areas. And lastly, there is scope to restore what has been damaged and lost. So in some cases, St. Mary's University, for example, and Dalhousie are collaborating on salt marsh restoration in certain parts of the Bay of Fundy, where they're allowing water back in, they're replanting native vegetation, and that ecosystem function gradually, hopefully, comes back over time. And eelgrass restoration is also possible in areas where it's been lost. You can walk out at low tide and literally just plant eelgrass shoots. But we're just at the very beginning of understanding how effective that can be in the long term, and that's something that EAC is doing quite a lot on. We're organizing a meeting next week with a bunch of experts to talk about eelgrass restoration, what the challenges are there, what the opportunities are there. And finally, this is my last slide. The first challenge that we have with protecting our blue carbon habitats is that we still don't really know where they all are. And so we are trying to find creative ways to fill these data gaps to understand where our seagrasses are in particular, because you can't always just see them from aerial photographs. And so one of our programs right now is recruiting kayakers around the province to help us do some surveys. And so we have little GoPro cameras that we strap to the boat. It swivels around to the underside of the boat and points straight down. And then we can sync the camera to a smartphone that has a GPS in it. So it'll give us a track like what you see here on the right. The blue line is the track that was paddled, and it'll take photos every 30 seconds or so throughout. So you get really nice sea bottom imagery along with GPS locations, and we can start to build a province-wide map. And this complements all kinds of work being done by other groups, but the advantage of a citizen science approach is that we have passionate, motivated people spread throughout the province already who'd be willing to do this, where it would cost an arm and a leg for a government group to come in and do it, or an academic group to come in and do it. So we're hoping that we can engage the Nova Scotian coastal communities on blue carbon and fill some of these data gaps to help push this field forward and make sure that we're preserving the climate functions of these areas. So that's pretty much what I had to say. As I said, we're just at the starting phase here of making this link between protection and climate change, and there's lots of initial work that has to be done around information gathering and figuring out methods for restoration and all that sort of stuff. But I really see this as a key area for the conservation community in oceans for the next couple of decades. So yeah, thanks very much, and I'd be more than happy to have some questions and some discussion.